On October 14, 1865, the fort was visited by the officer in command of the Department of Florida, General John Foster. In looking over the condition of things at the fort, the general took exception to a prisoner doing the work of a soldier. He ordered that Samuel Arnold be removed from his role as a clerk in the provost marshal's office. This was a blow to Arnold, who had been good at the work and appreciated having something easy to do for most of the hours of the day. General Foster also noted that no actions had been taken in relation to the warning General Baker had sent the fort back in August regarding a possible plot to free the conspirators. As a result, he ordered that the conspirators be placed in close confinement. The commander of the fort, Major Wentworth, had the dungeon fitted up in preparation to receive the 4 conspirators. When the Lincoln conspirators first arrived at Fort Jefferson, the commander of the fort warned them that disobedience would not be tolerated. According to Samuel Arnold's memoir, the commander impressed upon our minds that there was a dark and gloomy dungeon within the fort. As the fort was never designed to be a prison, there wasn't a true dungeon in the medieval sense. However, there were a few storerooms and corner bastions that did have doors that could be locked, a rarity in an otherwise open fort.
And it was into one of these bastions that the conspirators were placed. Now, we don't know exactly which one, but tradition holds that it is this one in historic Bastion D. And behind me, you'll see what was the entryway, which once housed a door. And according to Samuel Arnold, the door had a paraphrase from Dante's Inferno, which said, "Whoever so entereth here, leave all hope behind." Now, there are some pictures of the door, the historic door, that have a more succinct version of that, which just says, "Who enter here, leave hope behind."
On October 18, 1865, Dr. Mudd was removed from his cell near the guardhouse, while Samuel Arnold, Michael O'Laughlin, and Edmund Spangler were moved from their quarters in the second-tier casemates. The 4 conspirators were placed together into the dungeon. They were joined there by a 5th prisoner named George St. Leger Grenfell. Colonel Grenfell was a British soldier of fortune who had engaged in plots of terrorism on behalf of the Confederacy. Like the Lincoln conspirators, Colonel Grenfell was considered a high-profile state prisoner.
In the beginning, the conspirators were held in this dungeon pretty much constantly, only allowed to leave with a guard in order to use the bathroom. Eventually, leg irons were introduced, and the men were forced to go out and perform hard labor, the same kind that Dr. Mudd did after his escape attempt. They washed brick and cleaned down the bastions, but on some days, there'd be no work to do, and the men were just stuck in here. And the prolonged days and hours stuck in this dungeon by themselves started to take a toll on them. There were only 2 windows in the dungeon cell the conspirators were placed in, and both of them emptied out right onto the moat. Both Dr. Mudd and Sam Arnold recalled the terrible odors wafting in from their windows, and this was due to the sewer system here at Fort Jefferson. All of the privies emptied into a main sewer line, which emptied into the moat. Now, the design called for the moat to be periodically flushed through tidal forces, but it never worked correctly. And so instead, human waste started to accumulate inside the moat, and the conspirators had a very smelly view of the fort that they were trapped in.
The dungeon also had a flooding problem. Water that seeped down from above or into the room from the windows had nowhere to drain. The brick walls were constantly slimy and wet to the touch. Being trapped inside the room for days on end became a torture. In November of 1865, the 82nd U.S. Colored Infantry was replaced by the 5th U.S. Artillery. When this change occurred, Michael O'Laughlin asked the new guard for an explanation of the irons he was being forced to wear. O'Laughlin pointed out that he had not broken any rule of the island and that his sentence did not call for inhumane treatment. The officer of the day merely replied, "Sir, your sentence is nothing. We can do with you and to you just as we please." In this way, the conspirators and Colonel Grenfell knew that a change in their condition was not going to happen anytime soon.
Samuel Arnold wrote that during this time, the 5 men constituted the chain gang here at Fort Jefferson. When they were allowed to go out to perform labor, they were not allowed to talk to anyone, and they were closely monitored by a squad of guards.
About halfway through December, Arnold had a bit of luck. A prisoner who had been acting as a clerk in the commander's office was released after completing his sentence. Arnold was called for and asked to produce a sample of his handwriting. After making a positive impression, his duties were changed to that as a clerk in the adjutant's office. Very quickly, the commander became annoyed at the constant noise coming from Arnold's chains as he hobbled around the office. Arnold was then relieved of his leg irons, while his compatriots employed at hard labor continued to be stuck with them.
The commander moved Arnold out of the dungeon cell. His reason for this is that Arnold was now looking at essentially confidential information about the military goings-on at the fort, and the commander didn't want Arnold telling his cellmates all about it. So Arnold found himself placed here, in the same prison cells attached to the guardhouse that Dr. Mudd had been put in right after his escape attempt. Arnold hated life here in the guardhouse cells. The noise from all the soldiers in front of him made it difficult for him to sleep, especially when they were calling off the hours every night. He also missed the camaraderie of his friends. As wet and smelly and damp as the dungeon was, it was preferable to the isolation he felt here by himself. And so Arnold requested to be returned to the dungeon. Surprisingly, the commander agreed, and Arnold was reunited with his cellmates in that dank, dusty dungeon. On January 22nd, 1866, Dr. Mudd wrote the following about the conspirator's life here in the dungeon.
Imagine one loaded down with heavy chains, locked up in a wet, damp room, 12 hours out of every 24 during working days, and all day on Sundays and holidays. No exercise allowed except in the limited space of a small room, and with irons on. The atmosphere we breathe is highly impregnated with sulfuric hydrogen gas, which you are aware is highly injurious to health as well as disagreeable. The gas is generated by the numerous sinks that empty into that portion of the sea enclosed by the breakwater, and which is immediately under a small porthole, the only admission for air and light that we have from the external port. My legs and ankles are swollen and sore. Pains in my shoulders and back are frequent. My hair began falling out some time ago, and to save which I shaved it all over clean, and have continued to do so every week since. It is now beginning to have a little life. My eyesight is beginning to grow very bad, so much so that I can't read or write by candlelight. With all this, imagine my gait with the bucket and broom and a guard, walking from one corner of the fort to another, sweeping and sanding down the bastions. This has been our treatment for the last 3 months, coupled with bad diet, bad water, and every inconvenience.
On February 8th, 1866, Dr. Mudd wrote home to his wife, saying that the leg irons had been removed and some interest in the conspirators' health was taking place. This was likely due to Mrs. Mudd's own letters to the War Department in Washington decrying her husband's condition. About a week later, the 5 men were finally released from the dungeon. It wasn't a moment too soon. Sam Arnold noted that the flooding in the dungeon cell had become unbearable and that there was a foot of water in one corner. The men were looking forward to going back to the second tier, a nice ocean casemate where they might enjoy the refreshing sea breeze. Rather than being returned to a spacious casemate overlooking the ocean, the 4 conspirators were put here, right above the Sallyport entrance. The only windows of their new cell were 3 vertical slits, about 6 inches wide and 6 feet off the ground. A temporary wall had been placed between them and the nearest casemate, blocking out the light from the side. And so the only view that the conspirators had during their time here in the Sallyport cell was just a glimpse of the blue sky.
Samuel Arnold lamented how there was even less airflow in this new cell than they had experienced in the dungeon. Dampness was still a problem, and the brick walls of the Sallyport cell were described as a mass of slime and wetness. After every rain, the cell leaked badly, leading the conspirators to carve out holes and small ditches into the floor of the cell to collect the water to be bailed out.